all across America and around the world. This is Veterans Radio. This is Veterans Radio.
Good day. I'm Jim Fausone. I'm the officer of the deck today here on Veterans Radio, and thanks for joining us. We've got some interesting stories for you. We always want to remind you you can find more about Veterans Radio at its Facebook site or at the web, veteransradio.org, where we're on the web 24/7. You can find a lot of our podcasts there as well. We post new ones every Tuesday, so you can get a new story, a new interview, something you didn't know before by going to veteransradio.org. And before we get started, we want to thank our sponsors. First up, we want to thank National Veteran Business Development Council, nvbdc.org. It was established to certify both service-disabled and veteran-owned businesses. You'll find out how they can help your business by going to nvbdc.org. We want to thank Legal Help for Veterans. Legal Help for Veterans fights for veterans' disability rights all across the nation. You can reach them at 800-693-4800 or on the web at legalhelpforveterans.com. We just want to remind you that Veterans Radio podcasts are available on all your favorite streaming platforms, including rss.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and Rees Across America Radio. So wherever you are, you can find us, whether it's on your mobile phone or your computer or your laptop, your tablet. But listen in to Veterans Radio Podcasts. We post something new every week, and you're going to find it informative. We want to welcome to Veterans Radio today an award-winning author who writes a lot in the military space and history space, Mark Barie. Mark, welcome to Veterans Radio.
Thank you very much for having me, Jim. It's quite an honor and a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, as I've read about you, I know you were a New York guy and you were upstate New York writing a lot of local history books, and one thing leads to another, and you find yourself in Florida, and now you're writing about some Florida military history we want to talk about. I got to admit, when I read this article, I said, I never heard of this. And it's the Battle of Fort Myers, slaves fighting for their freedom.
That's correct. And I have to confess, Jim, until I moved to Florida myself, I didn't know about the Battle of Fort Myers either. So we're in the same pool.
Yeah, and that's why we're doing this, is because I think there's so much lost history, particularly history about how African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Japanese Americans, and all the other groups you might think of to categorize have fought for this country. But, you know, we teach so little history, those stories don't get told in high school or even college for that matter. So yeah, that's why this is important in my mind. Do you agree?
Those things get lost in the shuffle. This is true. But on the other hand, in defense of those of us who are ignorant about this battle, the big battle's got all the publicity. And most people don't realize, though, that Florida was important in the Civil War because it was literally the breadbasket for the Confederacy. And that's why the Union troops wandered on down here, because they wanted to stop all the beef and grains and everything else that's coming from the South to supply the Confederate Army. That was the only way they were going to defeat the Confederate Army. So the Union made their presence known, and that's how the battle started.
Well, this is 1865, right?
Oh. February 2nd, 1865 was the battle itself.
And put in some context what this fort was. Was it a Confederate fort that the Union took over, a Union fort? Tell us about it.
Well, it was a very small establishment, and at the time of the battle, it was very lightly staffed. There was only about 250 men there. In fact, they had just returned on the day of the battle. They had just returned a couple days early from another scramble elsewhere, a skirmish, I should say. And those 250 men, most of them were exhausted. They only had about 75 muskets between them, and even then about 30 rounds of ammo per musket. So it was not what you'd call the best defended fortress, controlled, so to speak, by the Union. The Confederates, on the other hand, knew what the Union was there for. They wanted to protect their food chain further north to the main Confederate Army. They had about 3 companies. They had about 400 men. They had a big 12-pound piece of artillery, and so they had it in their head that they were going to take this so-called Union-controlled fort away from the Union. And they surprised a couple of the African-American troops, as it turned out, who were outside of the walls of the fort doing their laundry, took them prisoner, fired a few shots, and those shots miraculously warned the folks inside the fort, and that began what would turn out to be an 11-hour battle between the Confederacy and the Union.
Well, and let's frame this a little bit more for those who aren't up on their Civil War history. African Americans or black troops were fighting as part of the United States Colored Troops, USCT. And that term sounds funny today, but can you put some context around it?
Well, the USCT turned out to be very, very significant. As you and I were talking earlier, African Americans ended up, by the end of the war, to be about 10% of the total fighting force of the Union, somewhere in the vicinity of 180 to 200,000 troops. And 37,000 African Americans ended up dying in the course of the Civil War because of their battle wounds and being killed in battle. So there was a long, slow process for them. You have to put it in perspective. The battle was 1865. It was about 2 years earlier, in January of 1863, that Lincoln had written and published and passed the Emancipation Proclamation. But that didn't mean that black troops were automatically integrated into the Union Army. In fact, they experienced a tremendous resistance wherever they went, often segregated. Even so-called all-black companies were commanded by a white officer. And so it was much like Jackie Robinson was decades later, hundreds of years later, when he got into the baseball. People don't realize that he wasn't a hero. He was treated like a goat, and not the greatest of all time, obviously, and discriminated against by some of his own teammates. The same happened with the USCT. So even though they fought with valor and courage, places like Port Hudson in Louisiana, Fort Wagner in South Carolina, several places in Virginia, including Spotsylvania, they were discriminated against. It was a very prejudiced atmosphere. And yet historians today realize that they were very tough bunch, the USCT. They were very courageous, tough as nails, extremely aggressive, and very united and cohesive group. And wherever they fought, they did a great job. They did an absolutely great job.
Well, nothing brings people together more than being in the foxhole together. And the colored troops that were at Fort Myers were kind of critical to this battle, weren't they?
They represented the bulk of the people that were there, the soldiers that were there, obviously, and they were credited with winning the battle. In fact, as a result of the black troops being there, several of them were cited for bravery, and they stunned the Confederacy. The Confederacy outnumbered them easily, but the white captain, a guy named James Doyle in the fort, was told to surrender because he was outnumbered, and the Confederates had a big 12-pound piece of artillery. The Union had a couple of 6-pounders. That was it. And his response was, "I respectfully decline." And he and his African-American counterparts decided to slug it out. And after 11 hours, the rebels simply called it quits. They did it that night. 40 Confederates lay dead, about half a dozen Union casualties, not much. Of course, they had the fort to protect them, but they had some very, very aggressive black soldiers that worked in and outside the fort and stunned the hell out of these Confederates, and that's why the Confederates ended up losing the Battle of Fort Myers.
And did this sort of end up being a line where, okay, we're not getting back this territory, and otherwise put a big dent, I suppose, in the pride of the Confederacy?
Well, you put your finger on one of the greatest ironies of the Battle of Fort Myers. Not only was it little known and quickly forgotten, but in 2 months, in less than 2 months, actually a month later, about after the battle, both sides in the Civil War abandoned the fort. It wasn't important anymore, and one of the reasons was, even at the time of the Battle of Fort Myers, the Confederacy knew they were losing the war. They saw the writing on the wall. A month later, it became very clear, black and white, no pun intended, And of course, General Lee surrendered the Confederacy April 9th, 1865, about 2 months after the Battle of Fort Myers. So a month later, the battle that lasted 11 hours, that cost that many Confederate troops, and that put the USCT on the map, so to speak, as far as historians are concerned, all went for nothing because both sides said, we don't need this fort anymore. The breadbasket for the Confederacy had pretty well dried up anyway, and the war was just a hop, skip, and a jump from being all over.
Well, you, in your article on this little-known topic, quoted the New York Times that reported the former slaves, quote, could hardly be restrained, close quote. They seemed totally unconscious of danger and constantly shouted to each other to get them, close quote, meaning the rebels.
I hate to use the word zealous because that's got a bad connotation these days. But these guys were zealous in fulfilling their duties. And, of course, some of it could be attributed to the fact that they felt they had to work twice as hard and be twice as effective as their white counterparts. But I think there was more than that, and I'm probably putting thoughts and maybe even words into these African-American soldiers' mouths and minds. But I think they knew they were under the gun, so to speak. I think they knew that they had everything at stake. They had, a couple years ago, been told by their president that they were all free. Now they had to fight for their freedom. And so they fought with gallantry, they fought with a fervor, and with a fever that the white soldiers during the Civil War did not have, because they were not fighting to free themselves. These troops, particularly those in the Fort Myers battle, I think they knew perfectly well that if they had to surrender to the Confederates, they would go back to their former lives as slaves. And many of those blacks in the fort were former slaves, and they did not want to go back, and they were prepared to put their life on the line to make sure they didn't go back.
We're talking to Mark Barie, who's a author, writes a lot of in the area of military and historical topics. One of the things I want to put context on, because I think, again, it's easy to kind of forget this stuff, is that, as you said, there were up to 200,000 African-American troops in the Civil War. Today, in the active Army, there's about 95,000 African-Americans, and they make up 20% of the active duty force. Where back in the Civil War, because so many more men were involved, they made up 10% of the Army. But the sheer number is somewhat staggering and easy to lose sight of when you're not paying attention to the history.
Over the decades, of course, the numbers have changed, so those percentages are kind of out of whack now compared to what they were back then. But and most people don't even know that, so thanks for bringing it up, Jim. But something else that a lot of people don't know is that the black soldiers performed above and beyond what their white counterparts did often. For example, right now, if you go back and look at the record, as a result of the war, there were 14 black soldiers that received medals of honor for valor in such places as the Battle of New Market Heights in Virginia and elsewhere. In total, the black troops of the USCT were recognized for exceptional bravery in 39 separate but nevertheless major engagements in the Civil War. This is an outstanding, disproportionate performance by African-American military men that proves their bravery, proves their courage, and proves their zeal in fighting not just for our country's survival, but their own survival and their own freedom. That's an outstanding record for any single group in the military, in my opinion.
Absolutely. One of the things, this the Battle of Fort Myers is, as we've talked about, kind of this significant event today. Fort Myers is a thriving area. A lot of people live there, but a lot of tourists come through. There must be some huge recognition of this battle and the role the black companies from the USCT played, right?
I can hear the sarcasm dripping, my friend. I can hear the dripping. No, there isn't. There's just one, as I put in that article, one of those ubiquitous blue signs with the yellow print, I believe, sitting at the mark of the fort. It's hardly noticed. It's very rarely mentioned in papers. In fact, I think the last time it got some publicity is the article that I wrote, and it's too bad. Working hard to make sure that it's not forgotten as the Sons of the American Revolution, particularly, excuse me, the not just the Sons of the American Revolution, but the one I'm a member of also, the Sons of the Union Veterans of the Civil War. They're all history buffs in these organizations, and particularly the SUVCW has tried to mark that occasion of the Fort Myers battle every single year. Tried to get out there and perform some sort of a ceremony with a color guard. But sometimes I think they're swimming upstream because we don't teach history in schools like we used to. In fact, you might find some public schools where history is not even taught at all. My own granddaughters, I love them dearly, but they came home and I found out pretty quickly they knew more about Harriet Tubman than they did about Abraham Lincoln. And so the history that is taught is a bit skewered. And unfortunately, battles like this that are militarily insignificant, but in my opinion, historically significant, get lost in the shuffle.
Yeah, and it's particularly true for the communities around which they were fought and the communities of men who fought in them. There should be more recognition. Let me point out that Mark is the patriotic instructor of the Colonel Robert W. Bernard Camp No. 2 of the Department of Florida Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War in Fort Myers. You can't get that on a business card.
No, but it's a high-paying job, I can assure you.
I'm sure of that. I hear the sarcasm. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about what you have written. You have a website. Folks can go to Mark Barie, and that's BARIE.com, to find these books, which are on Amazon. But they all have a little flavor of wartime efforts in different zones. Tell us about them.
Well, I essentially, the elevator version of this is I write about love in war. So I started backwards. I started with the Civil War because my wife, who's an expert genealogist, waltzed into the living room one day and announced that I had an ancestor that fought in the Civil War. And I got lucky, and I found a diary from that same regiment, the Adirondack Regiment, and my first novel was born. Prior to that, my wife and I had collaborated on a couple local history books. I had done a couple biographies back when we lived in upstate New York, right along the Canadian border. But when I moved to Florida, this is about 11 years ago, I thought I'd never write anything again, but that's when she announced this ancestor. So I wrote the book, had a lot of fun, and I'll warn you, if there's a book in you, Jim, if not already, that when you write your first book, all of your loved ones and your relatives and your friends and neighbors will say, oh, it was a wonderful book. I couldn't put it down. But you, as a first-time author, are suffering from this syndrome called imposter syndrome.
Right.
And I felt I was an imposter, but then the darn book won a couple of awards, and then my massive ego took over. And then after that Civil War book came a love story about the Revolutionary War, about a nun who leaves the convent and ends up spying for George Washington. And the War of 1812, which is set in the area where I come from, in Plattsburgh, New York, right along the border. That's about a girl disguised as a boy who ends up on the Commodore's flagship during one of the most important naval battles of the War of 1812. After that, I was going to do a book on the Spanish-American War. I never got past the mysterious explosion of the USS Maine. So the entire book is about the mysterious explosion, and I'm egotistical enough to tell you that my conclusions as to who and what caused that mysterious explosion made a couple of headlines in a few local newspapers. Had a lot of fun writing that. Even though that, too, was a love story, it's historically accurate, extremely accurate. And the most recent book published last year was about World War I, about a nurse from Newfoundland, Canada. Well, back then it wasn't Canada, it was the country of Newfoundland, who volunteered as a nurse and ended up in one of the most grisly, horrifying wars in the history of mankind, World War I. So it's been a lot of fun.
Well, this is an area called historical fiction, right? But being accurate on the history is not only part of the challenge, but part of the beauty, because this is how you get maybe somebody who otherwise wouldn't read a dry history book engaged in finding out what happened in the Civil War or in Havana or in World War I to this nurse. So historical fiction's, it stays here, I think.
Well, you just hit the nail on the head, and it's taken authors and readers a long time to figure that out. when you write, in my case, historical fiction, but I like to call it historical romance because there is the love side of that story. Your historical narrative must be extremely accurate because I sell most of my books in person. I go all over Florida. I think last year I did 25 speaking gigs all over Florida. And there's usually one history buff in the room. And if you've made a mistake, they'll correct you very quickly. In fact, as an aside, I was talking about the Civil War once, and this little old lady got up in the back of the room, and she said, "Sonny, down here we don't call it the Civil War, we call it the War of Northern Aggression."
Well, as we were going through this discussion today, I'm thinking, okay, I think I've just ticked off all the listeners south of the Mason-Dixon line. But
they're very serious, and I made other mistakes. I don't know if that was a real mistake, but I can remember it. And the first time I got the first 100 books of my Civil War novel, and I discovered that in whatever page number it was, I talked about a famous escape at Libby Prison in Virginia.
Sure.
And I talked about how the prisoners had this piece of rubber sheet that they used to put air into the tunnel. And then 100 pages later, the rubber sheet turned into a plastic sheet, which, of course, wasn't invented for another 100 some odd years. And boy, was that pointed out pretty quick. And there was a panic call to my publisher and make my long story longer. Even though it's historical romance, even though it's historical fiction, every single historical fact that can possibly be Googled or ChatGPT'd or whatever the hell it's called is accurate. For example, in the Civil War book, you read a section where Lincoln goes to the soldiers' home and visits prisoners. And except for the conversations, which you can take some liberties with, he was there. Trust me, he'd been there. That's what he did all the time. He visited the wounded soldiers. Any historical figure, any historical event in a book, even though it's called historical romance or historical fiction, must be accurate. And I'm very proud to say in all 5 of my historical novels is extremely accurate. I would defy anybody to find a mistake. Now, I'll probably live to regret that, but I don't think there's even mistakes.
Well, it's a genre I really enjoy reading. I hope our veteran radio listeners will tune into your books. You can find them on Amazon. You can find the whole genre of historical fiction there as well. And it's a great way to get introduced to some of these battles and concepts and what was going on back then, the history that you were never taught, but also wrapped in a way that will make it maybe a little more interesting, maybe keep you a little more engaged as a historical romance novel.
Well, I agree with that. And when I go all over and speak, I don't talk about my books. I don't know why anybody want to listen to me talking about my books. I talk about my research, and 9 times out of 10, I'm talking about what we've been talking about, little-known historical facts that many people find interesting, sometimes fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And I don't know how much time we got left, but Jim, I'll leave you with a real quick story about an African-American, the highest officer in the history of the Civil War, that happened to be African-American. His name was Alexander Thomas Augusta. His last name was Augusta. And believe it or not, he was a surgeon. And his initial acceptance in the Army was revoked for a couple of reasons. Number one, he was a black man. And number two, he had lived for 10 years in Canada, which back then was considered British controlled. So he was considered a British subject. And so they said, no, you can't join the Army. Well, he refused that answer. He wrote to President Lincoln himself and asked that the medical board reverse their decision. Lincoln agreed with him. The medical board changed their mind. They honored Augusta's initial acceptance. They made him a major and the head surgeon in the 7th U.S. Colored Infantry. Years later, he would advocate for equal pay for African-American soldiers. He wrote a letter of complaint to Senator Wilson back then. They raised his salary to the appropriate level and all of the other commissioned officers, too. And near the end of the war, guess what? He was awarded the honorary rank of lieutenant colonel, and he became the highest black officer in the U.S. military at the time. And around 1865, a president by the name of Lincoln, along with his wife, invited him to the White House, and he became the first African-American ever to visit the White House. End of trivia, end of story, and I'm sure your listeners will appreciate that.
No, again, this is why we do this, Mark, and we don't want to forget this kind of history. It's so important. We appreciate the time that you've given us today, Mark Barie. I send folks to your website, markbarie.com, learn more about what he's writing, and He probably has another book or two in him. I can just tell by the energy. So
I am. I'm working on one about the Russian Revolution of 1917.
There you
go. If you
go.
like Dr. Zhivago, you'll like this book.
Ah, great. Mark, thanks for your time today.
Thank you, Jim. Appreciate it.
And I want to thank everybody for listening to Veterans Radio today. I am Jim Fausone. It's been a pleasure to be your host. I'm a veterans disability lawyer at Legal Help for Veterans, and you can reach us at 800-693-4800 or legalhelpforveterans.com on the web. You can follow Veterans Radio on Facebook and listen to its podcasts and internet radio shows
by visiting us at veteransradio.org. That's veteransradio.org. We again want to thank our national sponsors, the National Veterans Business Development Council, nvbdc.org. Legal Help for Veterans, a veterans disability law firm with a national practice before the VA, can help you on your claims and your appeals. It can be reached at legalhelpforveterans.com or 1-800-693-4800. We also want to thank our local sponsors. This would include the Charles S. Kettles chapter of the Vietnam Veterans of America, that's chapter 310, VFW Graf O'Hara Post 423, the American Legion Irwin Preskin Post 46 in Ann Arbor as well, the VA Ann Arbor Healthcare System, and certainly the National Vietnam Veterans of America Association. You can be a sponsor by going to veteransradio.org, clicking on the About Us and our sponsors, and help us out. Keep this program alive for the 21 and 22 years. Keep us going for another 20. Thank you.